Welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour. We have a very, very special program today. I'm joined today by one of my heroes, really, one of the great men of the Donald Trump administration, U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. Hi, David.
Hi, Carolyn. How are you? Thank you for that introduction.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us today. We're taping this interview on Thursday, April 21st. And this evening is going to be the second holiday of Passover. And actually, I saw Ambassador Friedman earlier this week when he received a very important award, the Guardian of Jerusalem Award, the Guardian of Zion Award from Bar-Ilan University's Ingeborg Rennert Center for Jerusalem Studies, which is part of their Land of Israel Studies Department. And it was great to see you there. So first of all, Mazel Tov on the award.
Thank you.
And second of all, while I was listening to your talk, I was getting these updates on on my cell phone about what was happening in the news. And while you were speaking about all of the incredible things that the Trump administration did, and how important it is to have a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, and how Jerusalem really is the center of that. The Israeli government crumpled to the ultimatum of the coalition partner, the Muslim Brotherhood party that controls the coalition. They made an ultimatum that Jews have to be barred from entering the Temple Mount. And Prime Minister Naftali Bennett agreed to that demand. And since then, the situation on the Temple Mount and at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, has only grown worse. This morning, Palestinians at the Temple Mount at the Al-Aqsa Mosque were throwing fireworks and other explosives at Jewish worshipers in the Kotel, which is below. So first of all, just what are your thoughts about all hell breaking loose today and how you see events unfolding here in Israel?
It's just infuriating and disheartening. When I was in government, we had this, this flares up every now and then, and of course the goal of the Israelis has been, for many years, to have the conflict not devolve into a religious conflict, to keep it a political conflict, because religious conflicts tend to be much more violent and long-lasting. And I understand that, but at the same time, history has shown us that the more we cave into these false narratives about the Temple Mount, not being something that Jews have an interest in, or that or on the other side, the converse side, that Israel is assaulting the rights of Muslims to pray on the Mount. The more we give into that narrative, the more we just move backwards, and it only feeds into greater and greater violence. I mean, the reality is that I think every Israeli, if asked the question I wouldn't say every Israeli on the right, if asked the question, would say, look, the Temple Mount's the holiest place in Judaism, and Jews have the right to visit the Mount. I mean, there's a status quo, and there's all kinds of protocols that we can debate, but ultimately the entitlement of the Jewish people to be on the Temple Mount is not really in doubt, and has never been in doubt. And when we place that into doubt by compromising that right, it only gets worse, and it only feeds the violence, and it only encourages those who pursue this false narrative to push it even harder and more violently. So it's disappointing. I wish, and this is something I cared about from the day I left office, I wish I could get more people in the Arab world to visit Jerusalem. The rights afforded by the state of Israel to the Muslim world to have unfettered access to prayer at Al-Aqsa is unprecedented in the history of Jerusalem. And so this idea that our willingness to permit this false narrative that the Muslim world is under attack, and then to allow that narrative to be exported to throughout the Arab world, it does great damage to the moral high ground of the state of Israel, to the security of the state of Israel, and to the rights of the state of Israel to its biblical homeland. So I just hate what's happening, and I hate the idea that we are negotiating with Hamas or with other terrorist groups about what we may or may not do. I mean, this is, and it's not going to work. I mean, it's not even, the argument that, well, we'll do it because we'll save lives and keep things quiet, even that doesn't work. So there's absolutely no reason to do it. And I'm disheartened by it.
No, I agree with you. Last night there were reports, that there was supposed to be a parade of activists around the walls of the old city holding Israeli flags as a patriotic response to the violence that's emanating from the mosques and the Temple Mount. That they're, under constant incitement, not only from people on the Temple Mount, in the Waqf, and the Islamic authorities in Jerusalem, but also a steady stream from the Palestinian Authority, and even a steady stream from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, whose prime minister just made an incredibly anti-Semitic speech a couple of days ago, praising the Muslim rioters on the Temple Mount. And then rather than stand up to this incitement, the government, again, this was the next day, they canceled the march. They didn't allow the activists to march in Israel's capital with the flags of Israel, lest that be a provocation. And the left-wing news media in Israel were attacking this one far-right member of Knesset for daring to insist that Jews be allowed to be at the Damascus Gate outside of the walls of the old city, and so on and so forth. And then Hamas's media outlets were praising the fact that they had forced Israel to surrender without even shooting a gun. And at 2:00 in the morning, Hamas shot over 2 missiles at the Israeli border town of Sderot from Gaza. So, you're exactly right. I mean, you see when you collapse in the face of it all, and that really brings me to your book and to your time in office from 2017 to 2021 as President Trump's ambassador to Israel, because your book Sledgehammer is basically you start from the understanding, or from the insight, that when President Trump came into office in January 2021, the U.S.-Israel relationship was fundamentally broken, and that you had to make a clean break with that in order to go forward with President Trump's vision of peace through strength and of U.S.-Israeli ties, et cetera. Can you give me a little bit of a sense of what that insight was about, that the ties between the United States, that relationship was fundamentally broken when you entered office?
Well, I think the State Department's view of Israel from 1948 on was that Israel is more of a problem than a solution in the Middle East. That Israel is a country that can barely defend itself, that creates lots of friction between other American interests, that has the capacity to cause America to be at odds with its allies in the Persian Gulf, that it has the capacity to all by itself raise the price of energy. And so that, Israel has to be managed by America. There's an emotional attachment by America to Israel. So we want, it's a political interest that America has in Israel, but ultimately it's not really in America's best interest to do anything more than to manage that relationship. And through the leverage that comes with being Israel's strongest ally and Israel's strongest provider of foreign aid, to use that leverage to keep Israel from really fulfilling the will of its own democracy. We admire Israel's democracy, but America was basically saying to Israel, we don't care what your people want, you're going to do what we say. And that was all born of what I thought was a complete misconception as to what role Israel played in the Middle East. And the reality is that Israel is a solution, not a problem in the Middle East. And it just took us, I think, to open our eyes to recognize that Israel keeps America safe. Israel heads off threats that come to America before they get across the Atlantic Ocean, that Israel has technology and intelligence and commercial resources that benefit America greatly, and that ultimately Israel's neighbors care far less about these issues that we get caught up in America, these political issues between Israel and the Palestinians, that Israel's neighbors care far less about it than we think. And that, all these countries are going to act in their own self-interest, and those self-interests are much more in line with forming a moderate coalition within the Middle East than ganging up against Israel. So
but one of the things that's interesting is
Yeah.
that, I mean, I don't want to interrupt you, but one of the things that's interesting is that you're right. I mean, there were fundamental pathologies in the U.S.-Israel relationship going back to 1948 in terms of, like you said, that Israel is a burden, not a resource, not an asset to the United States. And there's a sense that Israel is a client state. And the only real reason that the United States even recognized Israel, let alone is helping Israel, is because US public opinion supports Israel. But that's a problem that has to be dealt with rather than a position that should be really analyzed and thought about for what it means in terms of how America views itself and how the world views America. But something, and we saw that throughout. We saw that, from Eisenhower through George W. Bush. But was there something fundamentally different or qualitatively different about the way the Obama administration viewed Israel in the way that its predecessors do, or do you think that it was just more of the same?
I think Obama was worse, and I think he took the next step that we had always hoped that no president would take, which was to view the relation to view the Sunni moderates as threats rather than assets as well. In other words, it was he thought that the way to fix the Middle East was to go after the worst actor, take the absolute worst actor and embrace that actor, because if you could embrace Iran and bring them around, well, then everybody else would that was the most difficult problem. Let's tackle that. And what I think he didn't grasp, and hopefully somebody will grasp it now, I think we're about to make the same mistake, is that you don't just kind of weakly go to your worst actor and say we want to be friends. What you do is you form alliances with your friends, and you collectively go to a country like Iran and say, these are the red lines that we won't tolerate, and if these red lines are broken, the consequences will be dire. Obama really thought that somehow all people are good, all people can be talked to. It's just about kind of reaching out and speaking with a gentle voice, and he eschewed the entire notion of strength. I think he was mocked by the Iranians, and I think the Iranians are mocking the current administration as well, because they're just speaking in different languages. And as we've said many times, and it's a cliche, but it's true, is that the only way to be respected in the Middle East is to be strong. And the United States right now has never been weaker in its geopolitical approach to the Middle East, or frankly anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think, and that really brings us to the revolutionary aspect of the Trump administration and its Middle East policies, because what you described is 70 odd years of official US animosity towards Israel, while you have popular US support for Israel. And so you have this sort of schizophrenic position on Israel. Israel is our friend, but we won't treat it like an ally. We treat it way worse than we treat any ally. And we're going to continue to do that. And we want to constrain its power and its sovereignty. And then along comes Obama, and he says, actually, what we want to do is be nice to our enemies and mean to our friends, because if we're nice to our enemies, then they'll be nice to us, and then everything will be great. And it's our friends' fault that they're our enemies anyway. So, let's go ahead. And then came Trump. And he, in a way, seemed similar to Obama in the sense that he was opposed to the Iraq war. He didn't want endless wars. He wanted it, but he had a totally different vision of how to reduce the US footprint in the Middle East. And when I think of your Sledgehammer, which again is the name of your memoir of service, I think of it as this was basically taking the past, ripping it to pieces or beating it to smithereens, and then going with the opposite approach. So why don't, from that lead off, where do you want to go with it?
Well, look, it's like it's like you break a bone, and you don't have it set correctly. It will heal, but it will heal, and it will not heal properly, and you'll be limping the rest of your life. And you go to a doctor, the doctor will say, "Look, I can help you, but I have to break it again. I'm going to break the bone, and we're going to reset it, and then it'll hurt for a while, but then you'll be better." And that's sort of the way we looked at it. I mean, it was so fundamentally misset, the U.S. policy towards Israel. And I think maybe the first area where it was really misset was the way we viewed the entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, first of all, we did two things that were really inexcusable. The first one is that we created a moral equivalence between Israel defending itself and Palestinian terrorism, and we threw in for good measure the idea that if Israel builds homes in territory that it has a perfectly good right to build homes in, that somehow that issue is a justification or on the same or equivalent to violent terrorism. So we made this, and that just did nothing other than prolong the conflict. And if that view returns as it appears to be returning, it will just simply prolong the conflict forever, because without saying to the Palestinians, look, we're holding you accountable for violence, we're holding you accountable for terrorism. You don't like where Israel's building homes, that's fine. I'm sure Israel's got lots of complaints right now. Israelis have lots of complaints right now where Palestinians are building homes. They're building 20, 30,000 homes or more, every year in Area C. They're not allowed to do. Okay, look, these are issues that can get discussed or resolved, or maybe when they fixed, but they have nothing to do with murder. And we made that mistake. And the second mistake we made was to say that until the Palestinians and the Israelis agree on everything, we're just going to freeze everything in the Middle East, freeze all progress. We're going to take the view that we're not going to do anything to help our ally Israel until they make peace with the Palestinians, which is essentially an impossible task. And I think when people say to me, what did you do that you think is the most significant? My view is everything led from moving our embassy to Jerusalem. Because the message we sent to the Palestinians, to our neighbors in the Gulf, and to the world was, number one, we were going to fulfill the will of the American people, right? Because you have a Jerusalem Embassy Act that passed with overwhelming support from Congress, and it wasn't being observed. And so we were going to say, look, this is America's view, democratically asserted view of how to deal with our embassy in Israel. And we're going to move our embassy because that's what Americans want us to do.
So that basically one of the most fundamental aspects of the Jerusalem Embassy Act was that it was a clear manifestation, perhaps the only one we've really ever seen, not the only one, most profound one that we've seen, of joining high policy, joining official policy with U.S. public support for a strong U.S.'s relationship, that it was the first time that you saw them in alignment. And that was also incredibly profound.
It was. And I think the message to the world was, look, we're going to do what we think is right. And we, the United States, are not going to take such a wooden and such a narrow view of our national security policy that we're not going to do what we think is right? Because the only reason not to move the embassy was because the Secretary of State would say, well, it's not in our national security. Well, you know what? There was never any real threat to American national security since 1995 if we moved the embassy, but we just used that as a throwaway. And so the first thing we said is, look, we're the United States of America. We're the strongest country on earth. We think we're the most moral country on earth. And we don't think that our national security will be impeded at all. In fact, we think it'll be aided if we fulfill the will of the American people on this issue. So that was an important message to the world. The message to the Palestinians is, guys, enough. The world is going to move forward with or without you. We're happy to talk to you. We're happy to discuss, issues that we can make this region, more prosperous, safer, more secure. But you don't get to say what the United States does, and you don't get to say whether we move forward or not, or what peace deals we make, or how we move forward. And that message, I think, not only was it the right message to the Palestinians, but it gave all the countries in the region, it gave them some space. they finally, it became okay to care about the Palestinians, but not to be in the pocket of the Palestinians. And that's really why moving the embassy to Jerusalem opened the door for all the things that we did going forward. And actually, people said it would lead to an explosion of violence. It actually led to an explosion of peace because we gave people the opportunity to breathe.
There was a really important op-ed that was written in the Jerusalem Post last month by a man named Mohammed El Yahya, who was the former English language editor of a Saudi daily newspaper. I think it's a Sharq Al Arswad, but I'm not sure. At any rate, he said when he was harshly criticizing, more harshly than the Israeli government, the current Israeli government has done, US's the Biden administration's nuclear diplomacy with Iran. And he talked about how profoundly troubling the Saudis, he particularly, but the Saudis in general in the Arab world, finds the US's betrayal of Israel. That if the United States is betraying Israel's existential security needs by essentially giving Iran an open path to nuclear arsenal, then how could the Arabs possibly trust them? And I think that the converse really is the Jerusalem embassy move, because I mean, it said to the Arabs, look, we're standing with Israel, you can trust us too. And this was after 8 years of the Obama administration's, wooing and courting and kissing up to Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood.
Look, I think whether it's the Saudis or the Emiratis or all the moderate Sunni nations in the region, they're all fighting the same fight that, frankly, people are fighting in Israel, and they're fighting in America and everywhere else. We're all fighting, radical extremism, and Israel's in the front lines of fighting radical extremism. And the United States, under the Trump administration, said to Israel, "We're with you. We're with you in this fight. It's your fight. It's our fight, and we're not going to place any impediments or handcuffs on you in defending that fight." And so, if you look at the 4 years that we were in office, like there were flare-ups from time to time, but there was nothing in the 4 years that we were in office that compared to, the war that immediately took place, almost immediately took place when with Hamas, when Biden took over, because the Arab enemies of Israel, the radicals, they're extremely perceptive and extremely intelligent. They understand exactly when they can move and when they shouldn't move, and they understood that it didn't make any sense to move against Israel when the United States was not going to limit Israel's ability of self-defense. And then so the moderate Sunni states are looking at this relationship between Israel and the United States, and they're saying, this circle of trust, if you will, we like to join. We think that's the best place for the geopolitical security of Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Bahrain, even Morocco. But as you point out correctly, if the United States, betrays Israel, then of course nobody in the region, no one in the Gulf is going to feel safe, because they view Israel as as the bulwark against radicalism. And if the United States is not going to protect Israel, they're certainly not going to defend any of these other countries. And so the U.S.-Israel relationship is watched extremely, extremely closely in this part of the world. And when there's no daylight, the whole region is safer and more secure. And when there is daylight, well, then you're seeing what we're seeing now. We're seeing rockets fired from Hamas. We're seeing fireworks thrown over from the Temple Mount into the Western Wall. Things that would be almost unthinkable.
It's so amazing when you think about it. I mean, that what happened during the Trump years with the Abraham Accords, and just more generally with the rebuilding of the U.S.-Saudi relationship after it was so deeply frayed, and now it's frayed perhaps even more fundamentally under the Biden administration. You see that all of the received wisdom, all of the the collective view of the U.S. foreign policy establishment in and out of the State Department throughout Washington was totally wrong, right? I mean, for decades, U.S. policymakers, Middle East experts, all were saying, well, we're going to ruin being friends with Israel is undermining our relationship with the Arabs, and we have to stop being friends with Israel in order to secure the supply of oil through the Suez Canal and through the Indian Ocean. All of these things are completely contingent on us being hard on Israel and us viewing everything that happens with Israel as sui generis, and the terrorism against Israel has nothing to do with the terrorism against us, and so on and so forth. And that was proven by the Trump years, by the Trump administration's building of trust, first and foremost with Israel, through the Jerusalem embassy move, to be totally wrong. But
No, it was totally wrong, and we knew it was totally wrong when we were looking at moving the embassy. We looked. We had lots and lots of conversations, and it was interesting. I did a documentary on the Abraham Accords, and there's one scene, very interesting comment by Jared Kushner when I was interviewing him on this. He said that he would go around and kind of preview this to a lot of different countries in the Gulf. And what they said to him is, look, we're not going to tell you to move the embassy. We're not going to tell you not to move the embassy, but we'll tell you this: if you move the embassy, you'll see who your friends are. and it was so true. It was so true. We moved the embassy, and the next day we're Israel's fighting with Hamas and pretty much nobody else. And the conversations and the relationships with all the other countries are just moving forward. Leaving aside the ceremonial votes at the UN, everything was just moved forward, and there was enormous respect within the region that the United States sort of had the courage of its convictions to move forward, that Israel was now benefiting from those enhanced relationships, and the local the Gulf wanted to join in. They wanted to be a part of it. They didn't find it threatening. They found it refreshing.
And of course the EU was also, they were absolutely having conniption fits over the embassy move.
But it didn't matter. It didn't matter. And even then, the EU does not speak with one voice. And there were I think when it was a little bit later when we put out a peace plan that provided for a lot significant bump in territory for Israel and Judea and Samaria. Even the EU, there were 6 or 7 countries that thought it was actually a pretty interesting proposal. So look, the world right now has got much bigger problems than dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they have a lot more to gain from being allied with Israel than to being opposed to Israel. And to the extent that they have a street that has to be placated, they will from time to time check some boxes to make sure that they feel like their street is duly heard. But I really think that ship has sailed in terms of the leadership of these countries. They see Israel as affording enormous opportunities, both commercially and in terms of national security. And I think that will continue. And it's something, I'm sorry about that. That's something we can build upon, and we need to build upon. But we're not going to build upon by chasing dumb deals with Iran.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. But I guess one of the things that's so jarring when we see that the accumulated wisdom of the foreign policy gurus in Washington was completely blown apart by reality when the United States tried something fundamentally different with you and with President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and others. The conversation didn't really accept that. It was so easy for Biden to revert back to the failed positions that had emanated from Washington until January 20th, 2017 on the Middle East, and with the Afghan pullout and with the renewal of the courtship of Iran under even worse terms now, to try to get them, no matter what happens, back into the failed 2015 nuclear deal. And it feels like, and we see it here as well, which we can get into a little bit when we talk more about the peace deal that you guys put together for Israel and the Palestinians. But it feels like the opposition that you guys faced domestically, you personally faced domestically from the American Jewish establishment or the liberal American Jewish establishment, and that Trump faced all the time with his demonization at the hands of the US media, that it was like they bent over backwards to block the conversation from keeping up with your progress, and that's what's enabling them to go back. And we're seeing all of the pathologies that we suffered through for all of the years before Trump, with Palestinian violence, with international condemnation of Israel when Israel never did anything wrong, the moral equivalence, or even worse, that we hear from people like Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. And it's like nothing, it's like they're trying to pretend that the last 4 years didn't happen. Do you
Yeah.
think that it's succeeding? I mean, why do you think it's even happening?
I think the slide back into failed principles is clearly happening, and it's happening not just politically, but it's happening in universities as well. Look, I went to law school at NYU, and there's a movement among law students at NYU. I think it's still a pretty good law school. You've got to be like in the top, half of 1% of your class to get in. So these are not dumb people. And there's a whole movement there. These are lawyers, these are future lawyers, smart people, saying that they think that, violence, terrorism is legally justified in the face of what they consider to be illegal occupation. They think as a legal matter, they think terrorism is justified. It's the appropriate legal response. Now that's really disturbing. I mean, these are not dummies. These are. I mean, when I went there, most of the people were pretty smart. Maybe they're not anymore, but they're certainly getting high test scores if they're going to this, getting in. And look, it's not just the politics. It's the fact that the politics scarily reflects a increasingly large portion of the American public. Now, the Jewish community in America is not doing its job because fundamentally, American Jews have always been uncomfortable being strong. They've always been uncomfortable with the idea. They love Israel as this kind of little underdog that is always attacked and manages to survive. But if Israel gets too strong and flourishes too much, or if there's somehow or if there's poverty which affects different groups disproportionately, all of a sudden Israel becomes a colonizer. And that's, look, American Jews have had a hard time being proud of their Jewishness. The goal to assimilate into America has been extremely powerful for a century. Part of it's because America is such a great country. Everybody wants to be part of it, but they want to be part of it in a way where they're totally accepted and don't have to acknowledge that they're maybe ethnically different. And that's a shame, because there's an enormous amount to be proud of in being Jewish. The politics are bad, but again, I think politics are just a mirror into the soul of a country, and America is certainly, the American population is losing support for Israel, and primarily because universities do not permit any real intellectually honest discussion of Israel. I mean, if you're a pro-Israel professor, you don't get tenure. So that's a bigger problem, I think, in the long run, than even the politicians.
I agree. I mean, I don't know why, what it sparked the memory today, but I suddenly remembered that I had been invited to speak at the Hillel of the University of Texas at Austin. I was supposed to speak there, I think, in November of 2016. And the supposedly pro-Israel organizations, AIPAC, among others, were too scared to have me come. And they suddenly said that I was too controversial, and the situation for Israelis on the right or pro-Israel speakers, and we see it very profoundly with people like Ben Shapiro, who's always there, not just flying in to visit, that what used to be acceptable but not liked, when visitors would come to campus and give speeches that the commissars of the left didn't like, has now become impossible. That the American Jewish kids don't want speakers who who are on the right because they're too afraid of what's going to happen to them, or because they're,
Yeah,
they
look,
don't, you know.
I've turned down invitations to speak because, you know, I'm told, look, you can come speak at this place. You're going to get shouted down a lot, and you know, nothing we can do about it. And I said, well, look, I got to tell you, life's too short. I'm not interested in fighting with people. I mean, if I'm going to sit there and be shouted, I'll lose my train of thought. I don't want to get into personal fights with people. I'm just not going to do it. And I feel bad that I feel that way, but I do, just because it's just not worth it to me. I don't have the, you know, life's short, and I don't want to spend the, you know, whatever, you know, I hope I live a long life. Whatever I have left, I don't want to spend fighting with 20-year-old college students who don't know what they're talking about, you know. So, and so there are probably other people like me, and we sort of just give up on this part, and we got to hope that other 20-year-old kids are smart enough and courageous enough to challenge their peers. Nobody cares what a 63-year-old gray-haired white guy says on any of these campuses, you know. But I hope that, you know, there's still enough of a core group to protect, you know, the pro-Israel position. But
I think that was, I think I was thinking about it because I was thinking about our conversation with you, my conversation with you that was going to be later in the day, and I was thinking that maybe that is the purpose of my podcast and many others, which is that, you know, we can't come to campuses anymore, but they can turn on their computer and they can get information and then use it. And so I guess I was, that's right, that you sparked the memory. That was why I was thinking about it. I was thinking, well, you know, maybe they'll watch this in other conversations, and they'll be able to learn something that they're not going to learn in their classroom. And I did just want to stop for 1 second, or I mean, there's so much to talk about with you here. And one of the things, since we're talking about the American Jewish community and their avoidance of having a conversation where they're going to actually have to get real skin in the game. I mean, it's really the American foreign policy establishment isn't the only one that has had a pathological relationship with Zionism and with Jewish nationalism, with the state of Israel. The American Jewish community has as well. And for, you know, many, many reasons, which I think I would love to have a separate conversation with you about that. But I don't want to get too far into the weeds. But one of the things that was really notable, I mean, you faced a lot of anti-Semitic slurs, really, when you were appointed, when you were nominated by President Trump to serve as the ambassador to Israel. And some of the people who were most outspoken in using the anti-Semitic, specifically American anti-Semitic canard of dual loyalty, were American Jews. I mean, you got it later on from Representative Ted Lieu, but you face this. What do you make of that charge, and how did you respond to it, and how do you look at the people, particularly the American Jews, but more generally, who make these charges against pro-Israel American Jews?
Yeah, I was really saddened by it. I was really saddened that that American Jews would question my fitness to serve the United States of America, because I thought the United States was best served by having a strong, unapologetic relationship with the state of Israel. First of all, there's lots of people who are not Jewish who feel that way, and there are lots of people of no religion, no faith, that feel that way. It's a mainstream American view, and you know what I found is because I'm Jewish, I was disqualified from asserting that view. You know, nobody accused Mike Pompeo of dual loyalty, right? He's just as pro-Israel as I am, right? Because he's not Jewish. So somehow, if Mike has a pro-Israel view, it's fine. If I adopt that view, and I do adopt his views, he and I are very much on the same page. Somehow I am betraying my country, and I'm acting, and I'm doing so because I'm Jewish. So it's sad that Jews would pick up that, you know, that mantra, which has for centuries resulted in, you know, the death and torture of tens and thousands of Jewish people. It's just sad more than anything else. So I really, you know, people said, you know, wear it as a badge of honor. It certainly didn't question what I was doing, but it was no badge of honor. It was just simply to me, it was a sad recognition of how far Israel has come, and how little the American Jewish community has come along with it. and it's very as someone who grew up, the son of a rabbi, my father was always involved in outreach to the Jewish people and extremely pro-Zionist. And it was, I felt that my father were alive to see this, he would be even more frustrated because he dedicated his life to convincing people that even if you live in America, you can still be pro-Israel and you should be pro-Israel. And I'm not seeing that cause has been advanced much in the last generation.
You have a statement that you made in your valedictory to Israel when you came and you addressed the Knesset just a few days before you left office. Mm-hmm. And you said there, and I remember I wrote about it at the time because I thought that it was one of the more significant things that you said, and you said many significant things during your tenure, but you said Israel has become the center of the Jewish people and center of Jewish history. I'm not gonna directly quote you, but essentially your message was that that the survival of the Jewish people in the diaspora is contingent on Israel taking up the mantle of leadership of the Jewish people and maintaining maintaining the trust that it's really seized by forming by establishing the Jewish state of Israel and by succeeding and surviving and becoming very powerful. And that really brings us to the question of how is Israel doing? And how do you guys worked very, very hard, and it was interesting, you negotiated it amongst yourself to put together a plan for peace, or a vision of peace between Israel and the Palestinians that itself was quite revolutionary. I mean, it had enough to scare people like myself and others when you talked about Palestinian statehood. But you saw that on the left, they totally didn't want it because it rocked their world too much, and they want to go back to what they know, which is to blame the Jews for the absence of peace along with the rest of the world. But the right also didn't like it, and it was one of the ongoing sources of frustration for me with my own ideological camp, that so many of its members didn't understand what was going on there. So can you just, first of all, explain a little bit about your thinking as a right-wing Jew? Sure. In a plan that was supposed to, in theory, establish a Palestinian state?
Well, first of all, really, it really all depends on how you define the word state. I definitely think this was a plan which was true to the principles of Yitzhak Rabin, who said that Oslo will lead to the Palestinians having less than a state. Mm-hmm. And I think this was less than a state. I mean, Israel controlled the borders. Israel controlled the airspace. Israel controlled the electromagnetic spectrum. Israel would have freedom of operation for security purposes inside whatever territory might have been ceded to the Palestinians. The Palestinians would have had civilian autonomy, and sort of in the words of Netanyahu, they would have had as much autonomy as would not threaten the state of Israel. And that obviously is very different than what we imagine statehood to be. And of course, it would also, what would have come with it would have been Israeli sovereignty over all of the communities in Judea and Samaria where Jews now live, in addition to a significant amount of territory for expansion and growth, as well as the entirety of the Jordan Valley. So it was, we put it out there and said, look, this is a discussion piece, and we got a very strong reception from the Prime Minister and the Likud party and others. So, but I want to go back and make a little bit of a point that you alluded to earlier in your question, which is, what is Israel's role now in the world and in the Jewish community? And the way we looked at it, I mean, the way I looked at it, I don't know that this was a view that really was shared by, within the Trump administration, because I was so much more involved in this than anybody else. But my sense was twofold. Number one, from the American perspective, we would stop this idea that we have to save Israel from itself, right? Which to me is an incredibly important concept. We would take the view, and I certainly have this view: Israel knows better than America as to what's best for Israel. America knows what's best for America. Israel knows best for Israel, and we would allow Israel to grow up and to mature into the thriving democracy that it is, and make its own choices and we would respect those choices, assuming they were made, in an appropriate, democratic way. So that was sort of, and that's how sort of you have to put the plan overlaid on on this, because ultimately the idea was to say to the state of Israel, look, more than half the countries in the United Nations are younger than you. You're not a fledgling state anymore. You've been around for 3/4 of a century. You have a very strong economy, a very strong military, a very advanced population, a very participatory democracy. People really get into it and vote and are active in it. So you know what? It's time for Israel to start deciding for Israel, what's best for it. And the biggest issue that I thought was, well, what's your eastern border? It's your longest border. What is it? Does it end at the Jordan River? Does it end someplace else? Is it this for one purpose and this for another purpose? What is it? And all you guys out there saying, we'll never give up the Jordan Valley, we'll never give up this, we'll never give up that. Okay, but meanwhile, if you live in one of these communities and you want to build a house, you go to the army. You don't go to the local zoning board, and that's not consistent with your view that it's always going to be yours. So what do you want to do? We're not saying you should make a decision tomorrow, but you need to have a national discussion and a real consensus, and you have to be prepared to make these decisions and then to advocate why you're doing it. And because all you hear in America, and you're not in America as much as I am, although I'm not there that much anymore either. But well-meaning Americans who don't have the time or the interest to really study the issue will continuously tell you that Israel is on a collision course, because it will get to the point where it could either be a Jewish state or a democratic state, but not both, right? That's and they believe it. And they think that Israel has to, as quickly as possible, jettison territory to the Palestinians for its own benefit. And what I say is, well, okay, look, that's a point of view, but what you're basically saying is Israel has to commit suicide in order to satisfy your own virtue signaling to to people that you think are underserved. Why don't you sort of start with the idea that Israel can be alive or dead, but not both, and let's focus on alive. And then once we solve the alive, we'll talk about all the fancier issues about the politics. And I just think that it's time for Israel to start to address these issues, because at the end of the day, if the world makes these decisions for Israel, Israel's not going to like the outcome. I mean, there's no, these may be tough issues, but the Israeli people have the right and the obligation to decide these issues for their own future, and not let the world. I mean, why does Israel have to sit around all day long and listen to countries that have no skin in the game and have no knowledge, no deep knowledge of the issues, have debates about what Israel should do with the Palestinians? It's not their issue. It's Israel's issue. And I believe the Israelis are well-meaning people. They're intelligent people. They want to get to the right outcome. They don't want to subjugate people. They want to get to the outcome, but they have to do it in a way where they don't commit suicide. But this discussion has been kind of observed in the breach by most Israelis. They don't want to touch it because it's almost like the abortion issue in America. Congress will never decide because it's too difficult an issue. America can get away with this, leaving it to the Supreme Court if that's what they want to do, but Israel can't get away with ceding such an important issue to other countries.
I agree. So, I mean, basically, just to sum up what you were saying is that you're saying, Israel, you're the center of the Jewish world. What happens here is going to decide not only whether Israel survives, but whether the Jewish people survive everywhere. Grow up. You're 75 years old. Be a grown up here. And it's so funny because when you think about all of the gifts that the Trump administration gave Israel, and I think you've made the point, and you proved in your actions that it not only helped Israel, they weren't only gifts to Israel, but they all advanced in a very, very significant way. The U.S.'s strategic standing, its posture, its national security in the Middle East and really around the world. So it was to the mutual benefit of both countries. But you guys went from the consensus, you went from Jerusalem, moving the embassy, you moved on. I don't remember what you did next, but you recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which, at least as far as Israel is concerned, is a consensus issue. I mean, and it hasn't really been discussed as something that Israel is supposed to, cough up for peace with the Assads since at least the Syrian civil war began, 13 years ago. So So that was also a consensus issue that you were able to just snap your fingers and have it done, and it was fine and important. And then you moved on to the Palestinians, and here really you set it up. You said, okay, look, the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria are not in their face, a priori or whatever, per se illegal. Just like anywhere else, there may be places that aren't proper, but they're not illegal. And that was important. And then you move. So you're saying to Israel, look, here are training wheels. Here, we're doing this. We're doing this. Now we're getting to the hardest issue for you. What do you want? Who do you want to be when you grow up? And in a way, it sort of was left like that, wasn't it?
It was. And look, you have to, again, Israel, if you respect Israel as a robust democracy and you believe the Israeli people are fundamentally good, certainly at least as good as people anywhere else, and that they have the capacity to act in their own interest, but also humanely and with with the values that we all hold dear, then you should be empowering Israel to make the decisions that most closely affect Israel. That's how friends treat friends. And then you overlay that, Carolyn, on the idea of the effect on the Jewish world. Look, in 1948, there were 5 million Jews in America, and there were 600,000 Jews in Israel. And you fast forward 74 years, and there's still 5 million Jews in America, and there's 7 million Jews in Israel, right? The entirety of the growth of the Jewish people throughout the world has been in the state of Israel. And it's I have no better way to say it than you said it. And of course, I use those words in my book as well. It's time for Israel to grow up and to confront the issues that are most pressing to its own people, to do it in a way which is not just democratic, but intelligent, where you value people's opinion, you give people the opportunity to debate and to talk about it and to think about it. And ultimately, what I've said many times is the world will respect Israel if Israel respects itself. If Israel makes a decision born of the right considerations that any country makes, whether it's national security, national identity, the best interest of its people, the world will respect Israel's decision. But Israel has to first respect itself enough to engage in this process to make those decisions.
And that really brings me back to the Biden administration. And to all of the Palestinian violence that we've seen, and Arab Israelis joining in and actually taking the leading role, like you said, since last May, since we had the first. You were saying it was the war between Israel and Hamas, but what's been very new, and we never have seen this before, and the dimensions and with the kind of sinister kind of character that we're seeing now, is that Israeli Arab citizens are taking the lead in attacking Israeli Jews. We had 4 murderous terrorist attacks against Israel over the past month, and the first 2 were carried out by Israeli Arab citizens. So we're seeing something new here as well. And you have Secretary of State coming and visiting and saying Israel is responsible for this way more than the Palestinians. Yeah, they shouldn't be giving money to terrorists, but you got settler violence, which is a lie. You have building and the expansion of the settlements, which I wish it were true, but under U.S. pressure and the pressure of the Israeli left, there's almost no building in Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria, and so on and so forth. So we're going back to the 1990s, or even worse, to the Obama administration's policies. And we're having this conversation. And it's like you said, how many times do I have to explain myself? Enough is enough. I won't go to campuses to tell them things. I feel like I wrote these articles explaining this stuff 20 years ago. I don't feel like writing them again. I wrote 500 of these articles. I don't feel like writing another 500. Enough is enough. And yet we're having these discussions, and it's like people are happy. They're back in their comfort zone, where we get to say, how dare you have a double standard for Israel? And, and we're not responsible. And yes, we are responsible. And there is this sense like we're never getting off of this merry-go-round. We don't want to be off. We like it.
Yeah, I don't know why anybody would like it. It's pretty disheartening. And look, I actually, look, I'm I'm somebody who believes strongly in the land of Israel, and I could be considered right wing by most people, but I also really believe in, in protecting the minority rights of citizens, and I think that one of the really admirable things about Israel has been that it has, treated the minority rights of citizens. I don't think it's good for, Israel has kind of, I think, allowed itself to have, to view itself as sort of, in the population is primarily in the center of the country, and then it kind of defers the triangle to Arabs without giving them enough police protection. I don't think you can do that. I don't think you can ignore the Bedouins in the south, and I don't think you can ignore the Haredim in their neighborhood. Israel has got to be a nation of all of its citizens and find a way to incorporate them. It doesn't mean you agree with extreme ideologies, but it's too small a country to have these little pockets of resistance where people just don't follow the laws.
Right.
And I think it's so, I kind of maybe foolishly had some. It didn't bother me that it didn't bother me that Ram was in the government. It bothered me that Ram was in the government with a controlling position, right? I mean, I don't mind. 2 million Arabs should have representation. They want to fight for better policing and better resources and better streets and better roads. That's how you participate in democracy. You get involved and you fight. It's just not when you make the difference between, the coalition living and dying. That's really where the problem was.
It's very funny. I think the thing that really got me thinking about speaking to you and the importance of this podcast, at least aspirationally, is we're in Pesach now. We're towards the end of the holiday. It ends on Saturday night, or it really ends whatever. I mean, it gets extended because of Shabbat, and then we go into Yom HaShoah and Yom HaAtzmaut. So this is really the time where we're reflecting on our freedom here in Israel and as Jews, and what happens when we don't have freedom. And your speech, your acceptance speech on Tuesday was just it was almost like a sermon, because you really, you were talking about the biblical roots of the United States, of the Declaration of Independence, of the Constitution, of the way that Americans view themselves. While you were here, one of the acts that you did towards the end of your tenure was you brought over Paul Packer, who is in charge of U.S. heritage sites, and you guys declared the city of David an American heritage site. And when we reflect on how quickly the Biden administration and this new Israeli government have really deteriorated U.S.-Israel relations and what stands behind it, the nihilism or progressive ideology that stands at the root of so much of what's happening now. Can you just spend a little bit of time now reflecting on, the biblical roots and their importance, not only in U.S.-Israel relations, but in really the survival of these countries?
Sure. Well, look, America was founded, through its Declaration of Independence on certain unalienable rights, and those unalienable rights were considered to be endowed by God. Right, which was a revolutionary concept, that human rights are endowed by God. They're not endowed by the sovereign, which means they're not negotiable, they're immutable, they're not subject to political vagaries, and that's what began with America being a great country. And I pointed out, I won't do it here because of the time, but all the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they all find their roots in various biblical passages. And so America was founded upon this, these biblical principles. All of which were espoused by God and by kings and prophets and priests that walked the streets of Jerusalem, in particular, right around the city of David, which is why we consider it an American heritage site. The bigger point, though, is that as America gets more and more untethered from these values, we grow weaker as a nation. We just do. We can debate this for a long time, but if when you think about what made America great, it was principles of personal responsibility and accountability, along with generosity and freedom and equal rights and equal opportunity, and that's what made America great. And we are now in so many different ways, and it's every day's newspaper. We're now seeking to kind of reshuffle the deck and change the rules, and you know, everybody gets, every ethnicity or particular viewpoint or particular you know, orientation now gets graded on the basis of how disadvantaged they may have been over the last, you know, several hundred years, and then they get, you know, they get slotted into the system, you know, on a point system where, you know, kind of, it doesn't matter what your character is, it doesn't matter what you have in your heart, it doesn't matter how hard you work, all that matters is the accident of your birth, or the accident of how you self-define. And so that's, you know, look, we've had great empires in our history. You know, we the last couple were the Ottoman Empire. You know, that's not there anymore. The British Empire, you know, England's still there, but the British Empire is gone. And I'm petrified. I'm petrified about the end of the American Empire, because this is how empires end, right? They lose touch with their foundational values. And so and Israel is
You're having trouble now. You kind of froze.
the only country that you can't hear me.
Now I can. Can you go back? You were just saying, and Israel is.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Look, Israel, you know, Israel and Jerusalem in particular is sort of the North Star of the American values that made America a great country. And America needs Israel, and Israel needs America. We're the only two countries founded really on these, you know, ancient values that served the world well for millennia. You know, we lose connections to them. We don't really stand for anything anymore. And, you know, I mentioned this thing, you know, that, you know, Moses, you know, in his great, you know, swan song speech to the Jewish people, where he was very harsh. I mean, remember, you know, you would think Moses might have been an anti-Semite the way he spoke to the Jewish people as he was preparing to depart this world. And he said, you know, you guys have to stop doing what you're doing, which is everybody is just doing whatever they think is right. I mean, no one is tethered anymore to values or laws or principles. Everybody's just doing, you know, ish kol hayashar be'einav yaseh. Everybody just does whatever they think is right. And it's a very apt description of America, particularly, and also the world. People are just kind of making it up as they go along. They're using the they're all trying to kind of self-validate the worst choices that they make. They're allowing their capacity to rationalize bad behavior to run amok, and this has profound implications for, you know, the future of the world. When America is, you know, people aren't really thinking about what does the world look like in the absence of an American empire, you know, and in the absence of America leading the world. What does the world look like? It's frightening. It's a frightening thing, and we're starting to see, you know, things coming apart now. And Biden gets up and says, look, I'm not going to start a fight with you because you have a nuclear weapon. I'm not going to start a fight with you because, you know, you could change the cost of the cost of our energy. I'm not going to start a fight with you because my base doesn't like it. And we're just, you know, giving all the bad actors of the world free rein to, you know, do whatever they think is right in their own eyes. And it's very frightening.
You know, it's funny because I was when you talk about, you know, what Moses said to the people of Israel, look, you can't just do this, you have to do that. So, you know, as you know, one of the final prayers that we say in the prayers is Aleinu. And Aleinu is all about the kingdom of God and the sovereignty of God over everything, and that what we want is for all the people on earth to recognize God's supremacy and all the rest of it. And you have these the American Jewish liberal worldview is based on a complete distortion of the Aleinu prayer, which is one of the most particularistic prayers. I mean, all Jewish prayers are particularistic for, you know, prayers of a specific of people,
right,
and a specific homeland with a specific set of laws. And they said they took two words out of context, you know, to repair the world is to repair the world for the kingship of God, and to repair the world. And those two words are what they used in order to transform Judaism into communism. And, you know, and you have, and you see it being played out in so many different ways. And you know, and I think he really brings you back to, you know, what Moses was saying, right? I mean, he was saying, you have to teach your children, you have to teach your children, you have to be able to talk to them, and you know, you do it so well. And
Well, look, we're not, we're not all freelancing. I mean, we don't just get up in the morning and do whatever we think we want to do. And of course, the words in Aleinu, I mean, you can doubt the significance of Aleinu anyway. I mean, it's a single prayer written by one guy, I'm not sure. I don't even know if anybody knows the source, but it's L'takein olam b'malchut Shaddai. It's not just L'takein olam, right? So it's in the kingdom of God, and God informs us in the Bible what kind of a kingdom He wants. It's not just, it's not, you decide that the world would be better if we had higher taxes. The world would be better if we opened up our borders. The world would be better. I mean, that's not your choice to make. There is a Malchut Shaddai that God has explained to us what it looks like, and it doesn't look anything like the progressive approach that's being taken.
no, it doesn't. Well, I want to keep you on for another 3 hours and talk about all of these issues in depth. Maybe we'll do it in a separate one, because I'm not going to keep you for another 3 hours. You won't stay anyway. But I do just want to take the opportunity here to thank you, and to thank Secretary of State Pompeo, and to thank President Trump and everyone, because I mean, I think you're such, you showed what it means to be an ally. I mean, so many years we're saying, oh yes, Israel is the most important ally the US has in the Middle East, and then they treated us like a client state and a welfare queen and whatever. And you guys did it, and you brought peace to the region, and where it gets undone or doesn't get undone, if we're able to endure and strengthen everything. I mean, your contribution, your personal contribution, the Trump administration's contribution more generally, is so profound and so historic that no award can encapsulate what you've accomplished, and I just want to thank you very much.
Well, you're very kind. I appreciate it very much, and I actually think the best days are still ahead. We've created a template for success, and whether or not the template is going to be used now, success does breed success, and we will, we'll take a few steps forward and backward and forward and backward, but ultimately I think we will move forward, and I'm certainly personally committed to seeing that through.
Well, I wish you long life till 120 or 123, as you may like, and Chag Sameach to you and to all of our viewers and listeners. And I hope very much that we'll have more and more discussions of this type in the future, because I think that your voice is so critical, and what you've accomplished is so important. And you're right. I mean, you can ignore as much as you want the Biden administration, Israel's new government, everybody. They can ignore as much as they want what happened over the 4 years of the Trump administration, but it stands out clearly as proof that the received wisdom was totally wrong, and it's time to use that sledgehammer and move forward. So thank you very much, and Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Karen. Chag Sameach to you too. Thank you.